In this video, we will go over all the criminals executed in the history of the state of Arizona, United States. We will explore the crimes they committed, their last words, and the meals they chose before their executions. Donald Eugene Harding. In January 1980, 30-year-old Donald Eugene Harding began a series of murders in Arizona. On January 25th, he killed two businessmen at a Tucson motel after posing as a security guard. He beat them, tied them up, gagged them with socks, and shot them. He stole belongings and fled in one of the victims' cars. That same night, he killed another man in Phoenix using a similar method of asphyxiation. He even visited the home of one of his victims without knowing he had already killed him. The autopsy revealed that one of the victims had died from asphyxiation, not the gunshot. Harding was arrested that same day in Flagstaff by a police officer. During his arrest, it was discovered that Harding had escaped from the Pulaski County Jail in Little Rock, Arkansas, on September 17, 1979, where he was awaiting trial for a stabbing murder. During his 4 months of freedom, he was suspected of committing around 24 crimes, including multiple murders, kidnappings, and car thefts. He was ultimately linked to at least 6 murders in Arkansas, California, Texas, and Arizona. Donald Harding was executed on April 6, 1992, at 12:05 a.m. in the gas chamber of the Arizona State Prison in Florence, becoming the first person executed in Arizona since 1963. He was 43 years old at the time of his death. Governor Fife Symington did not intervene to stop the execution. Harding's last meal consisted of fried eggs, several strips of bacon, buttered toast with honey, and orange juice. When asked for last words in the gas chamber, he remained silent. John George Brewer. In November 1987, 21-year-old John George Brewer murdered his 22-week pregnant girlfriend, Rita Breyer, in her Flagstaff, Arizona apartment after a dispute over his emotional dependency on her. During the attack, Brewer beat her, bit her, attempted to gouge her eyes, and strangled her first with his hands and then with a tie. Afterwards, he showered, committed sexual acts with her body according to his confession, and voluntarily turned himself in to the police. In July 1988, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and requested the death penalty, which was imposed by a court that deemed the crime particularly heinous, cruel, and depraved. Psychologists determined that despite his borderline personality disorder and pathological dependency on his mother and Breyer, Brewer was legally competent. While on death row, he expressed delusional beliefs about a god named Dantane and a savior child named Fro, whom he claimed he had killed in his girlfriend. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld his conviction in January 1992, and Brewer waived all appeals, insisting he deserved the death penalty. He was executed on March 3, 1993, at 12:18 a.m. by lethal injection at the Arizona State Penitentiary. His last meal the day before his execution consisted of pork chops, bacon, fried shrimp, rice-a-roni, French bread, applesauce, beverages, coconut cream pie, soup, and coffee. No last words were recorded before his death, although he had previously stated that death was an appropriate punishment for his crime. James Dean Clark. In December 1977, 20-year-old James Dean Clark murdered 4 people at the Coach's Guest Lodge and Ranch in Elfrida, Arizona, where he worked as a cowboy. After a night out with colleagues and ranch guests, Clark returned to the lodge and stabbed and shot George Martin Jr. and Gerald McFerrin while they slept, before killing the owners, Charles and Mildred Thumb. He then stole jewelry, money, and weapons, slashed the tires of the ranch vehicles, and fled in the Thumb's truck, heading to El Paso, Texas, where he sold items belonging to his victims. He was arrested days later, and, although he denied remembering the murders, He was linked to the crime through physical evidence and testimony from a confidential informant who implicated him in the killings and the sale of weapons. Clark was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder on June 23, 1978, and sentenced to death on July 28 of the same year, with the Arizona Supreme Court upholding most of the aggravating factors related to pecuniary gain and depravity. While on death row, he married a psychiatric nurse who visited him in prison. His initial legal representation was inadequate, and it later emerged that he had suffered severe childhood abuse, suicide attempts, and post-traumatic stress disorder. His last meal included steak, shrimp, baked potato, salad, desserts, bread, and a strawberry milkshake. His final words, spoken with his lips, were "I love you" to the psychiatric nurse he married, who witnessed the execution. His last request to touch his wife, who was present for the execution, was denied by the prison execution team. Jimmie Wayne Jeffers. Jimmie Wayne Jeffers, 30, was arrested in Arizona in 1976 alongside his girlfriend, Penelope Cheney, for narcotics possession and stolen property. While in Pima County Jail, he discovered that Cheney had cooperated with police and even offered money to another inmate to kill her, though the letter was intercepted. After being released on bail, he lured Cheney to a Tucson motel under the pretense of giving her heroin. There, he injected her with an overdose that did not kill her, so he ultimately strangled her and beat her body while insulting her and blaming her for prior arrests. He kept her body in the motel shower for 3 days before burying it near Sedona. Jeffers was arrested, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder in 1978. Although his first death sentence was overturned, he received the death penalty again in 1980, which was upheld by the Arizona Supreme Court. One day before his execution, he had a last meal of steak, peas, buttered rolls, strawberry cream pie, and a large chocolate malt. On September 13, 1995, at the age of 49, he was executed by lethal injection at Florence State Prison. Governor Fife Symington did not intervene. When asked for last words, Jeffers reportedly shouted a series of obscenities and made an obscene gesture toward his executioners and witnesses. There are no official records of the exact words or gestures he used. Darren Lee Bolton. Darren Lee Bolton, born in 1966 in Illinois, had a childhood marked by family instability and emotional problems from an early age. By the time he was 15, he was already connected to the disappearance of a young girl in Tucson, and 4 years later, he committed a crime that shocked the community: the abuse and murder of a 2-year-old child. The investigation lasted over 4 years, until 1990, when a computerized fingerprint system identified him as the perpetrator. At that time, he was already serving a sentence in Illinois for another crime. In 1992, Bolton went to trial, and despite his attempt to blame an alleged accomplice, the jury found him guilty of kidnapping, burglary, and first-degree murder, sentencing him to death. He was ultimately executed by lethal injection in Arizona on June 19, 1996, after waiving further appeals and maintaining his innocence until the end. His last meal consisted of lasagna, cheesecake, and Pepsi, and he did not speak any final words. Among the witnesses to the execution were Zosha's parents, Alan Pickett and Linda Pickett Smith, who carried a photo of Zosha tied to her waist, as well as 5 members of the Fritz family. Bolton only glanced at the witnesses once when the death chamber curtain opened, briefly looking at Zosha's parents before averting his eyes and not acknowledging anyone else present. At the time of his death, Bolton was 29 years old and still awaiting trial for the 1982 murder of Kathy Fritz. Luis Mata. On March 10, 1977, Luis Mata met 21-year-old Deborah Lee Lopez, who that night was looking for her boyfriend at a Phoenix bar. There, Mata encountered her. According to a witness, the victim was held against her will, beaten, and attacked by Luis and his brother Alonso before being taken unconscious to the outskirts of the city, where Luis killed her. Both brothers were arrested shortly after and convicted of first-degree murder. Initially, they received the death penalty, but after appeals and changes in the law, Alonso received life imprisonment while Luis retained the death sentence. The case was surrounded by legal controversies, including allegations of racial bias by the judge and what was considered inadequate defense. It was also argued that Luis had a history of brain injuries, low intellectual capacity, and a childhood marked by violence and abuse. Luis Mata was executed by lethal injection on August 22, 1996, at Florence State Prison, Arizona. The execution was delayed for several minutes while the courts reviewed last-minute appeals, but it was carried out at 12:50 a.m. Before his death, Mata requested as his last meal beef burritos, pork chops, French fries, and jalapenos. His final words were simple but meaningful. "Tell everyone I'm sorry." According to witnesses, at the start of the execution, he bowed his head and began praying the Lord's Prayer, but stopped before losing consciousness. Randy Greenawalt. Randy Greenawalt was a criminal whose career ended marked by one of the most infamous prison escapes and massacres in Arizona's history. In 1974, at age 25, he had already killed 2 truck drivers, one in Arkansas and one in Arizona, during apparent robberies at rest stops. After being arrested alongside his brother and another accomplice for using one of the victim's credit cards, he was sentenced to life in prison. However, his fate changed in July 1978 when he participated in the famous Florence prison escape with Gary Tyson, aided by Tyson's 3 sons, who smuggled weapons into the prison in a cooler. Without a single shot being fired, the 5 escaped, but the flight soon turned into tragedy. The next day, the group kidnapped the Lyons family, a young couple, their 22-month-old baby, and a teenage niece, after they stopped to help on the highway. Greenawalt and Tyson brutally executed them in the desert. Days later, in Colorado, they were also linked to the murder of a newlywed couple from Texas, though that case never went to trial. Finally, on August 11, 1978, the fugitives were captured following a shootout with police in Casa Grande, during which one of Tyson's sons was killed. Gary Tyson managed to escape into the desert, but died shortly after from exposure. Greenawalt, however, was prosecuted and sentenced to death for the murders of the Lyons family under Arizona's felony murder law, which allows the death penalty for direct accomplices in violent crimes. Greenawalt spent nearly 2 decades on death row. He was executed by lethal injection on January 23, 1997, at Florence State Prison, Arizona. His last meal, one day before his execution, consisted of a cheeseburger, French fries, and a café au lait. When asked for final words while strapped to the gurney, he said, "I have prayed for you many times, and the Lord is using you well. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." William Lyle Woratzeck. William Lyle Woratzeck was executed for the brutal murder of 36-year-old Linda Louise Leslie, a Huntington's disease patient who rented a small room from him in Casa Grande. In the early hours of March 6, 1980, Woratzeck broke into her home and attacked her savagely. He struck her with a hammer, stabbed her with a kitchen knife, and finally strangled her with such force that he broke her neck. He then stole about $107 and set fire to the shed where she lived, reducing both her body and belongings to ashes. The autopsy revealed Leslie had been alive throughout the attack, suffering prolonged agony. Her vulnerability, having the mental capacity of a 15-year-old, was a key factor in the prosecution classifying the crime as especially cruel and depraved. Investigators quickly focused on Woratzeck, who was already facing financial difficulties and tensions with Leslie's family over overdue rent. Stolen items were found in his trailer, along with fibers and bodily fluids linked to the crime scene, though his defense argued the police had closed the case too quickly without considering other suspects. During the trial, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and burglary, and sentenced to death in 1982. His case went through a lengthy appeals process, reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. After more than 15 years on death row, William Lyle Woratzeck was executed by lethal injection on June 25, 1997, in Florence, Arizona. His last meal, one day before execution, was large. A 16-ounce medium-rare sirloin steak, French fries, onion rings, a dozen fried butterfly shrimp, a whole cherry cheesecake, a box of Pepsi Cola, and a pot of coffee. Strapped to the gurney and asked for last words, he said, "I want the state of Arizona to know they are executing an innocent man. Tell my wife I love her, and tell the rest of my family I love them." At the time of his death, Woratzeck was 52 years old. His final meal, including a whole box of Pepsi and a pot of coffee, was one of the largest in Arizona execution history. José Jesús Ceja. José Jesús Ceja, born in 1955, was just 18 years old when, on June 30, 1974, he brutally murdered Randy and Linda Leon in Phoenix, Arizona. Ceja had broken into the couple's home to steal a shipment of marijuana, but upon encountering 22-year-old Linda, he attacked her and shot her first in the chest and then in the head. When 24-year-old Randy returned home, Ceja killed him with his own gun. After the double homicide, he stole 70 pounds of marijuana and, in a display of audacity, even attended the victim's funeral and offered his help to the police. He was arrested shortly afterward and sentenced to death in 1976, though his case went through multiple trials and appeals due to procedural irregularities and changes in capital punishment law. Despite his youth, poverty, history of family abuse and drug use, and even efforts by the judge who sentenced him to spare his life, the courts upheld the death penalty. He spent 23 years on death row, the longest period recorded in Arizona at the time, where he was noted as a model inmate with no violent incidents. José Jesús Ceja was ultimately executed by lethal injection on January 21, 1998, at Florence State Prison, Arizona. His last meal consisted of 2 red chili beef burritos, 2 cans of Coca-Cola, and a slice of cherry pie. When asked for final words, he remained silent. José Roberto Villafuerte. José Roberto Villafuerte, a 30-year-old Honduran citizen, was arrested in February 1983 following the brutal death of 47-year-old Amelia Chauville, with whom he had a relationship. Evidence presented showed that Villafuerte beat Amelia, tied her to a bed in his Phoenix trailer, and gagged her with a makeshift ball made from sheets. Police found the victim semi-naked, covered in blood, and showing signs of sexual assault. She died after 24 hours of agony from asphyxiation. Villafuerte claimed the incident was a drunken fight and that 2 friends were supposed to release her, but he could not provide evidence of their existence, the weakening of his defense. On July 18, 1983, he was found guilty of kidnapping, first-degree murder, and robbery, receiving the death penalty along with additional prison sentences. His case sparked international controversy due to a violation of the Vienna Convention, as he was never informed of his right to consular assistance as a foreign national. The Honduran government, the Vatican, and even the U.S. State Department recognized this irregularity, but the courts upheld the sentence. During his 14 years on death row, Villafuerte was seen by some as an inmate whose degree of premeditation in the murder remained somewhat unclear. Villafuerte was executed by lethal injection on April 22, 1998, at Florence State Prison, Arizona, at the age of 45. His last meal included grilled chicken, tortillas, rice, jalapenos, and soft drinks. His final words before death were, "I love you all, and I am going to be with the Lord." His execution, carried out despite international appeals and a personal plea from the president of Honduras the night before, set a precedent in the application of the death penalty to foreign nationals in the United States, drawing strong criticism for the violation of international treaties. Arthur Martin Ross. 35-year-old Arthur Martin Ross meticulously planned the murder of 26-year-old real estate agent James Rubel in Tucson, Arizona. On April 10, 1990, posed as a businessman named Michael Davis to lure Rubel into an empty office and, armed with a 9mm pistol, shot him twice in the head during an attempted robbery. After the murder, Ross used Rubel's credit card and identification to withdraw money, buy a car, and effectively assume the victim's identity for 4 days before being arrested, thanks to ATM camera footage and fingerprints. Ross's trial began in December 1990 and concluded in February 1991, resulting in a conviction for first-degree premeditated murder and armed robbery. The prosecution presented strong evidence, including photos of Rubel's credit card usage, fingerprints, and the murder weapon found in Ross's car. The court considered 2 aggravating factors: pecuniary gain and the cruelty of the crime, and sentenced him to death. Ross had an extensive criminal history across multiple states and was on probation at the time of the murder. Ross chose to become a volunteer by waiving additional federal appeals and accepting his fate after 7 years on death row. He was executed by lethal injection on April 29, 1998 in Florence, Arizona, without speaking final words. His last meal included grilled cheese sandwiches with egg, macaroni and cheese, mint chocolate chip ice cream, and 2 cans of Pepsi. He was 43 years old and became the 11th person executed in Arizona since executions resumed in 1992, just 1 week after José Roberto Villafuerte. Douglas Edward Gretzler. In October 1973, 22-year-old Douglas Edward Gretzler, along with his accomplice Willie Luther Steelman, began a violent crime spree that resulted in the deaths of 17 people in less than 2 months. They started by robbing and kidnapping individuals in Arizona and California, killing several of them, including Michael and Patricia Sandberg in Tucson and the Parkin family in Victor, California, in an extremely brutal manner. During the crimes, Gretzler and Steelman stole money, valuables, and credit cards, displaying notable cold-bloodedness in staging crime scenes and manipulating survivors. After being captured on November 8, 1973, in Sacramento, Gretzler confessed to the murders and was convicted in California for 9 homicides, receiving concurrent life sentences. He was later extradited to Arizona to face trial for the Sandberg murders and related crimes, was found guilty, and sentenced to death on November 15, 1976. During appeals, his defense argued that he was under the influence of amphetamines and lacked premeditated intent, but an execution date was ultimately set. Douglas Edward Gretzler was executed by lethal injection on June 3, 1998, at 3:11 p.m. in Florence, Arizona, marking the state's first daytime execution. He was 47 years old and had spent more than 21 years on death row. His last meal consisted of fried eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and 2 Coca-Colas. Strapped to the gurney and asked for final words, he said, "From the bottom of my soul, I am so sorry and have been remorseful for years for killing Patricia and Michael Sandberg. Although I am being executed for that crime, I apologize to the 17 victims and their families." Donald J. Miller. 28-year-old Donald J. Miller participated in the June 1992 murder of 18-year-old Jennifer Guder, alongside José Anthony Luna, who had hired Miller over a child support dispute. After an initial shot that did not kill Jennifer, Miller shot her 5 more times in the head in a desert area near Tucson, ensuring her death. Following the crime, both men attempted to destroy evidence and clean the vehicle used, while Jennifer was found the next day by a morning runner. Miller was arrested after a search of his residence and refused a plea deal, leading to a trial in July 1993, where he was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and kidnapping. During the proceedings, it was revealed that Miller had endured an extremely abusive and traumatic childhood, including severe domestic violence and exposure to sexual assaults against his sister, though these factors did not prevent his death sentence. Donald J. Miller chose to become a volunteer for execution, waiving federal appeals and maintaining this decision until the end. He was executed by lethal injection on November 8, 2000, at 3:37 p.m. at the Arizona State Prison Complex. His last meal included guacamole toast, tacos, a strawberry milkshake, Dr. Pepper, lemon meringue pie, jalapenos, a lemon, a lime, and strawberry ice cream. Robert Charles Comer. In February 1987, 30-year-old Robert Charles Comer committed a series of violent crimes in Arizona, beginning with the murder of paramedic Larry Pritchard, whom he invited to dinner and then shot and stabbed. After stealing Pritchard's badge, he posed as an Arizona drug enforcement officer and attacked Jane Jones and Richard Smith, kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and robbing the couple. Jones escaped after 23 hours in the desert, while Smith reported the incident to authorities, leading to the capture of Comer and his accomplice Juniva Willis. Comer's 1988 trial was highly controversial. He waived his right to be present and during sentencing was brought into court handcuffed and naked, a point central to later appeals. Despite these irregularities, he was sentenced to death for the murders and other serious crimes. For years, he sought to be executed voluntarily, acknowledging the gravity of his crimes and accepting responsibility for the lives he had destroyed. He was executed by lethal injection on May 22, 2007, at the Arizona State Prison Complex. His last meal included fried okra, buttered rolls, salt, and banana bread. His final words were, "Yes, let's go Raiders," an apparent reference to the Oakland professional football team. Throughout the execution, he maintained a defiant, smiling demeanor until losing consciousness. Jeffrey Timothy Landrigan. In 1989, 25-year-old Jeffrey Timothy Landrigan escaped from a prison in Oklahoma and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where he committed a violent murder, killing Chester Dean Dyer, a man he had met days earlier. The crime scene showed stabbing wounds and lacerations, along with physical evidence directly linking Landrigan, such as bloody fingerprints and a shoe print in sugar matching his footwear. During the investigation, Landrigan denied knowing the victim and blamed someone else, though witnesses and evidence clearly implicated him. Landrigan had an extensive criminal record, including a prior murder in 1982 and a brutal assault on another inmate in 1986. His trial in Arizona resulted in convictions for robbery, second-degree burglary, and felony murder, and he was disturbing and uncooperative during sentencing. Decades later, it was recognized that his defense had been inadequate, and key information about childhood abuse and brain damage had not been presented, which might have prevented his death sentence. He was executed by lethal injection on October 26, 2010, at the Arizona State Prison Complex amid controversies over the supply of sodium thiopental. His last meal included steak, fried okra, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and Dr. Pepper. His final words were, "Well, I'd like to thank my family for being here and all my friends, and Boomer Sooner," in reference to the University of Oklahoma's battle cry, of which he was a fan. Eric John King. In December 1989, 26-year-old Eric John King committed a double murder during a robbery at a convenience store in Phoenix, Arizona, killing the clerk and the security guard for just $72. Key evidence included video recordings, a distinctive sweater, and a recovered gun, thanks to the testimony of a witness who identified him at the scene. Although he was sentenced to death in 1990, doubts about his guilt arose years later, including the recantation of a key witness and questions about the quality of the physical evidence and the video used at trial. King had a traumatic childhood and a criminal history, including convictions for rape and kidnapping, and had spent several years in prison before the murders. His execution was marked by controversy due to the use of imported sodium thiopental, raising concerns about the drug's safety. He was executed on March 29, 2011, at the Arizona State Prison Complex by a 3-drug lethal injection. His last meal consisted of fried catfish, collard greens, candied yams, cornbread, chocolate cake, tomato, pink grapefruit, and cream soda. When asked if he had any last words, he simply said, "No." Donald Edward Bey. In May 1984, 29-year-old Donald Edward Bey murdered 13-year-old Christiane Fornoff after sexually assaulting her in her apartment in Tempe, Arizona. For 2 days, he kept her body hidden while pretending to be concerned, even participating in the search and attending the victim's funeral. The investigation collected physical evidence linking him to the crime, including fibers and ferret hairs matching his apartment, as well as a confession he made to a psychiatrist during a group therapy session. After a first trial ended in a mistrial, Bey was convicted in a second trial of first-degree murder and sexual assault, receiving a death sentence on July 20, 1985. His disturbing and manipulative behavior, including his participation in the search and attendance at the funeral, deeply affected the community and the victim's family. Over the following years, he faced multiple appeals regarding procedure and evidence, all of which were denied. He was executed on May 25, 2011, at the Arizona State Prison Complex. His last meal consisted of a beef chimichanga with sauce and guacamole, a double cheeseburger, French fries, Rocky Road ice cream, and Diet Pepsi. His final words were, "I just want to say to the Fornoff family, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. God will let you see her again. Freddie, I love you, I kept my promise. Thank you for being here for me." Bey was 56 years old and had been on death row for 27 years, becoming the 26th person executed in Arizona since the resumption of the death penalty in 1992. Richard Lynn Bible. In June 1988, 26-year-old Richard Lynn Bible kidnapped and murdered 9-year-old Jennifer Wilson from Yuma while she was riding her bicycle near Flagstaff, Arizona. He took her to a secluded location where he sexually assaulted her and beat her to death, leaving her body covered with branches and debris for 3 weeks. Bible had stolen a vehicle to commit the crime, and police located him after a chase, finding key physical evidence, including the victim's hair on his clothing and Jennifer's blood on his shirt. Bible had a significant criminal history, including prior convictions for sexual assault and kidnapping of a teenage girl in the same area. During his 6-week trial, overwhelming physical evidence linked him to the murder, including the first use of DNA technology in a homicide case in Arizona. He was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child abuse, and sentenced to death in 1990. He was executed on June 30, 2011, at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. His last meal consisted of eggs with cheese, hash browns, biscuits with country sausage gravy, peanut butter and jelly, and chocolate milk. His final words were, "I want to thank my family and my attorneys. I love you all, and everything is okay, that's all." Bible, 49 years old at the time of his death, had spent over 20 years on death row, becoming the 27th person executed in Arizona since 1992. Thomas Paul West. In July 1987, 28-year-old Thomas Paul West returned to the home of Donald Bortle in Tucson, Arizona, intending to steal electronic equipment. When confronted by the homeowner, he brutally struck him on the head until he was unconscious, then tied him up and left him bleeding in a closet, where he died from blood loss in less than an hour. West fled to Phoenix with the stolen items, selling them and boasting about the crime to several acquaintances, which ultimately led to his arrest in Illinois during a routine traffic stop. West's trial relied on his confessions to multiple people and recovered physical evidence, including Bortles' stolen items. He was convicted of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft, receiving the death penalty in 1988. During clemency hearings, evidence of his childhood trauma, including physical and sexual abuse resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder, was presented, but the majority of the Board of Clemency declined to commute his sentence. He was executed on July 19, 2011, at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, despite last-minute appeals regarding the lethal injection protocol and catheters used. West declined to request a last meal, and when director Carson McWilliams asked if he had any final words, he ignored him, remaining still with his eyes closed as the lethal injection was administered. Edward Harold Shadd, Jr. In August 1978, 40-year-old Edward Harold Shadd, Jr. intercepted 74-year-old Lorimer Leroy Grove, who was traveling from Bisbee, Arizona to Washington in his Cadillac with a trailer and several $1,000s in cash. Grove was strangled with a rope, and his body was found 8 days later in an advanced state of decomposition alongside a road near Prescott. A month later, Shadd was arrested in Utah driving the victim's Cadillac and in possession of several of Grove's belongings, including credit cards he had used and a forged check. The crime gained additional attention due to Shadd's criminal history. In 1968, he had been convicted in Utah for strangling another man, a case he claimed was accidental. Shadd was sentenced for Grove's murder in 1979, though that conviction was overturned, and a second trial in 1985 again sentenced him to death. His attorneys prolonged the process for more than 2 decades with appeals in state and federal courts, arguing there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder, although the theft of the victim's vehicle and belongings proved decisive. Ultimately, on October 9, 2013, at age 71, Shadd was executed at Florence State Prison in Arizona by lethal injection of pentobarbital. His last meal, hours before his death, consisted of a meatball sandwich, French fries, corn, apple pie, and a vanilla milkshake. When asked for his final words, he said, "After 34 years, I am free to fly home," apparently referencing a religious hymn he had received days earlier. He was pronounced dead at 10:12 a.m. Robert Glenn Jones, Jr. In May 1996, 26-year-old Robert Glenn Jones, Jr. began a wave of violence in Tucson, Arizona, that culminated in the murder of 6 people. Alongside his accomplice, Scott Nordstrom, he broke into the Moonsmoke shop on May 30th, where Jones shot a customer in the head and then attacked the employees, killing 26-year-old Thomas Hardman, while another survivor escaped to alert police. 2 weeks later, they struck again at the Firefighters Union Hall, where Jones executed 3 patrons at the bar, and Nordstrom killed the bartender when he couldn't open the safe, taking $1,300 from the premises. A month later, Jones committed a 7th murder in Phoenix, linked by police after tracking purchases made with the victim Richard Roll's credit card, whom he had killed with a shot to the head. Arrested for this crime, Jones pled guilty and received life imprisonment, but he was soon also tried for the 6 Tucson murders. In 1998, after a 10-day trial, he was found guilty on multiple counts, including 6 counts of first-degree murder, and sentenced to 6 consecutive death sentences plus an additional 144 years. Key testimony came from David Nordstrom, the brother of his accomplice, who detailed Jones's confessions about the crimes. On October 23, 2013, at age 43, Jones was executed at Florence State Prison in Arizona. He declined a special last meal and ate the regular menu of the day: meat pies, mashed potatoes with gravy, and carrots. He gave no final words and maintained his innocence until the end. At 10:35 a.m., he received a lethal injection of pentobarbital and was pronounced dead 17 minutes later. Joseph Rudolph Wood III. In August 1989, 31-year-old Joseph Rudolph Wood III broke into the Dietz family auto body shop in Tucson, Arizona, and murdered his ex-girlfriend, 29-year-old Deborah Dietz, and her father, 55-year-old Eugene Dietz. Wood's relationship with Deborah had been tumultuous, marked by multiple episodes of violence and breakups. That morning, Wood shot Gene in the chest, killing him instantly, and then pursued Deborah, executing her with 2 shots. When he tried to flee, he aimed his gun at the confronting police officers, prompting them to shoot him and leaving him critically injured. In 1991, a jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault on officers. He was sentenced to death for both murders, along with concurrent prison sentences for the other charges. Wood spent over 2 decades appealing unsuccessfully until his execution date arrived in 2014. He and his attorneys attempted to block the procedure, arguing that Arizona planned to use an experimental cocktail of midazolam and hydromorphone, but the state Supreme Court lifted the last-minute stay, allowing the execution to proceed. On July 23, 2014, at age 55, Wood was executed at Florence State Prison in what became the longest execution in U.S. history. Although it was expected to take 10 minutes, it lasted nearly 2 hours. 11 minutes into the procedure, he began gasping violently, and witnesses reported that he struggled to breathe over 600 times, like a fish out of water. His final words were, "It comforts me to know that today my pain stops. And I said a prayer that today or any day you may find peace in all your hearts, and may God forgive you all." He died at 3:49 p.m., leaving behind a case that sparked intense criticism of lethal injection methods in the country. Clarence Dixon. In January 1978, 22-year-old Clarence Wayne Dixon committed the murder that would eventually put him on death row when he raped, stabbed, and strangled 21-year-old Arizona State University student Deanna Lynn Bowden with a belt. The crime occurred just 2 days after Dixon had been released following a previous case in which he was declared legally insane for assault. For decades, the murder remained unsolved until 2001, when DNA evidence directly linked him to the victim, by which time he was already serving a life sentence for another rape committed in 1985. In 2008, Dixon was tried for Bowden's murder. Amidst severe mental deterioration, he fired his attorneys and chose to represent himself, convinced that the DNA evidence was invalid and part of a government conspiracy against him. The jury was never informed of his history of mental illness, trauma, and hallucinations, nor that he had been legally insane at the time of the crime. He was found guilty and sentenced to death on January 24, 2008. On May 11, 2022, at age 66, Dixon was executed at Florence State Prison in Arizona, marking the state's first execution in nearly 8 years. His last meal consisted of KFC chicken, strawberry ice cream, and water. Before dying, he stated, "The Arizona Supreme Court should follow the law. They denied my appeals and petitions to change the outcome of this trial. I proclaim and will always proclaim my innocence. Now, let's get this over with." During the procedure, he mocked the medical team and, as the lethal injection began, said to his victim, "Maybe I'll see you on the other side, Deanna. I don't know you and don't remember you." The execution encountered complications when executioners failed multiple times to insert intravenous lines, causing cuts and bleeding before completing the process. Frank Jarvis Atwood. In September 1984, 28-year-old Frank Jarvis Atwood kidnapped and murdered 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson, who disappeared while riding her bicycle to mail a birthday card in Tucson, Arizona. Atwood, who had a long history of crimes against minors, intercepted the girl and was seen by witnesses driving with a small child in the passenger seat. Days later, he left the area. Vicki's remains were found in the desert 7 months later. Forensic investigation linked him to the crime through traces of pink paint in his car that matched the victim's bicycle. In 1987, after a 2-month trial, he was convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to death, in addition to receiving a life sentence for the kidnapping. On June 8, 2022, at age 66, Atwood was executed at Florence State Prison in Arizona. He arrived in a wheelchair due to a degenerative spinal condition and was positioned on the gurney with the aid of a medical pillow. His last meal consisted of salami, mustard, peanut butter, jelly, wheat bread, tortilla chips, and water with juice. Before dying, he addressed his words to the Orthodox priest accompanying him. "Thank you, precious Father, for coming today and guiding me toward faith. I pray that the Lord have mercy on all of us. I pray that the Lord have mercy on me." The execution faced complications when the medical team was unable to insert the IV in one arm, and Atwood himself suggested using his right hand, in what a journalist described as a surreal scene. Murray Hooper. On December 31, 1980, 31-year-old Murray Hooper participated in a contract killing in Phoenix, Arizona, alongside William Bracey and Edward McCall. The three broke into the home of William Patrick, Pat Redmond, and his family on New Year's Eve. Under threat of weapons, they forced the victims to hand over money and jewelry. 2 people were killed, while Redmond's wife survived and later identified the perpetrators. The attack had been planned by a Chicago crime leader seeking to take over part of Redmond's business. In 1983, Hooper was sentenced to death alongside Bracey for first-degree murder, kidnapping, attempted murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy. During the trial, the prosecution presented witness testimony and evidence directly linking him to the crime, including the surviving victim's identification and accomplice statements regarding the contract killing. Hooper maintained his innocence until the end, and his attorneys unsuccessfully sought new DNA and fingerprint evidence. On November 16, 2022, at age 76, Hooper was executed at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. His last meal consisted of KFC fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, barbecue sauce, a roll, cheesecake, ice cream, and Fanta. Before the lethal injection, he said, "Everything has been said. Let it be done. To all my attorneys and loved ones, don't be sad for me. Don't cry. Don't say goodbye. Say, I'll see you later. Let's go." The execution encountered technical difficulties inserting the intravenous lines, but it was ultimately completed through lines in his right leg and right forearm. Jess James Gillies. In January 1981, 20-year-old Jess James Gillies and his accomplice Michael Logan committed one of the most horrific crimes in Arizona. They tricked 26-year-old Suzanne Rossetti by offering to help her with her car, then kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and held her captive in her own apartment while stealing her belongings. That same night, they took her to a cliff outside Phoenix, threw her off a 12-meter drop, and when they saw she was still alive, they threw rocks at her and buried her under stones. The autopsy revealed that Rossetti was alive for several minutes after being buried. Police tracked the suspects using her bank card and found a receipt with Gillies' name in the victim's car. Both were arrested 5 days later, and Gillies confessed to the crime. On August 28, 1981, a jury found him guilty of computer fraud, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, and first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and received lengthy sentences for the other offenses. His accomplice, Logan, was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in prison in 2021. Jess James Gillies was executed by lethal injection on January 13, 1999, at 3:06 p.m. at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. He was 38 years old at the time of his death. He did not give any final words nor request a last meal. Derek Leonard Gerloff. In January 1975, Derek Leonard Gerloff was convicted of robbery at age 19, beginning a criminal path that would ultimately lead him to death row. On January 24, 1980, along with Joseph Encinas and James Leisure, he randomly targeted 22-year-old Scott Schwartz, a young man on crutches who offered them a ride. Shortly after getting into the car, Gerloff pulled a gun on Schwartz and forced him to drive into the desert, where he demanded money under threat. They then pulled him out of the car and brutally beat him for over 10 minutes before deciding to kill him to prevent him from identifying them. Gerloff attempted to run Schwartz over multiple times with the vehicle, eventually succeeding. Then, while Schwartz was still alive and begging for his life, Gerloff stabbed him over 20 times with a screwdriver, and Leisure added another 10 to 20 stabs. Days after the crime, one of the accomplices confessed to a friend, who alerted the police. All three were arrested and confessed. Gerloff's trial began on December 15, 1980, and lasted 4 days. He was found guilty of murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. He received the death penalty for the murder and additional sentences for the other charges. Over the course of 18 years of appeals, all of his legal arguments were rejected. Encinas was sentenced to life in prison, while Leisure, after pleading guilty, also received a life sentence but was released in 2002 after serving 21 years. Gerloff's last meal, served a day before his execution, consisted of a medium-cooked New York strip steak with Worcestershire sauce, 2 eggs, 8 strips of bacon, 2 slices of buttered toast, mint ice cream, and apple juice. The execution took place on February 3, 1999, at the Arizona State Prison in Florence by lethal injection. Gerloff became the first Native American executed in Arizona since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. When asked for his final words, he remained silent. Karl-Heinz Legrand. On January 7, 1982, 18-year-old Karl Legrand and his half-brother, 20-year-old Walter Legrand, attempted a violent robbery at the Valley National Bank in Marana, Arizona, which resulted in the murder of 63-year-old bank manager Kenneth Hartsock and the attempted murder of 20-year-old employee Don Lopez. Both had recently been released from prison for armed robberies in Tucson. During the assault, the brothers tied and gagged their victims, frustrated that they could not open the vault. Hartsock was stabbed 24 times with a letter opener. Lopez was attacked but survived. The brothers fled without obtaining any money and were arrested the same day in Tucson. They were convicted in 1984 of first-degree murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, and attempted robbery and sentenced to death. Their convictions were upheld in 1987. The case gained international attention because both were German citizens and had not been informed of their right to consular assistance as required by the Vienna Convention. They later contacted the German consulate themselves, but appeals based on this omission were rejected by U.S. courts. Karl Legrand was executed by lethal injection on February 24, 1999, at the ASPC Florence Central Unit at age 35. He had initially requested to be executed by gas chamber alongside his brother to challenge the constitutionality of the method, but changed his mind at the last moment, delaying his execution by 2 hours. His last meal included roasted chicken, 9 corn tortillas, 2 tomatoes, jalapenos, rice, and 2 cans of Pepsi. His final words expressed remorse. "To the Hartsock family and to Lopez, I'm sorry this has taken so long and dragged on, but from the bottom of my heart, I regret what I did." I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I mean that sincerely from the bottom of my heart. I pray and wish you the best I can. I cannot imagine your loss. I mean that sincerely. I didn't want to do it. To my family, I'm sorry for what I put you through. I have no animosity, bitterness, or hate toward anyone. To those administering this process, I have asked for forgiveness, and am willing to forgive as well. God bless you all. I love you. The execution began at 7:56 p.m. and ended at 8 p.m. Reports say Karl kept his eyes open for a long time, but no visible signs of suffering were documented. Walter Bernhardt Legrand. As noted above, Walter Legrand, Karl's half-brother, was executed 1 week later for his role in the same crime. Walter Bernhardt Legrand was executed on March 3, 1999, at the Florence Central Unit in Arizona at age 37. He chose execution by gas chamber over lethal injection, hoping the method would be declared unconstitutional for its cruelty. His brother Karl originally chose gas but switched to lethal injection and was executed days earlier. Walter's execution was delayed several hours as courts reviewed last-minute appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court briefly stayed the execution, but the U.S. Supreme Court quickly overturned the stay. At 9:15 p.m., cyanide pellets in sulfuric acid were released beneath his chair. Legrand began coughing violently and gagging before falling forward. His body continued to show spasms and shallow breathing for several minutes. He was pronounced dead at 9:30 p.m., 18 minutes after the procedure began. He was the last person executed by gas chamber in the United States to date. The execution was witnessed by Don Lopez and family members of Kenneth Hartsock. Several witnesses described the scene as distressing. Lopez broke down in tears and was escorted out of the room. Walter Legrand's last meal included 6 fried eggs, 16 strips of bacon, French fries, a pint of pineapple juice, and 2 cups of coffee. In his final words, he expressed remorse toward the family. I just want to say sorry to the Hartsock family. First time I really got to see that photograph, possibly referring to a photo of Kenneth Hartsock held by his daughter. I am truly sorry. I hope you find peace. I want to thank Helen, Hartsock's sister, for forgiving us. I want to tell her children and Don Lopez, I hope you find peace. To all my loved ones, I hope you find peace. To all of you here today, I forgive you and hope to be forgiven in my next life. That's all I have to say. Robert Wayne Vickers. Robert Wayne Vickers, known as Bonsai Bob, was sentenced to death for brutally murdering his cellmate Frank Ponciano in 1978, while serving time for multiple robberies. Vickers strangled and stabbed Ponciano with a sharpened toothbrush after Ponciano drank his Kool-Aid, then carved his nickname into the victim's back. Later, in 1982, he killed another inmate, Wilmar Holsinger, by setting him on fire with an improvised incendiary bomb following a personal dispute. This second murder resulted in a new death sentence. During more than 20 years on death row, Vickers was known for extreme violence, making improvised weapons, attacking guards and fellow inmates, and even attempting a dramatic escape. His medical history included epilepsy and possible brain damage, which his defense used to argue that the prison system had created the monster he became. However, he was found fully responsible for both murders and remains the only Arizona inmate sentenced to death for killing another prisoner. Vickers was executed by lethal injection on May 5, 1999, at age 41, at Florence State Prison in Arizona. He made no final statement, and no information is available about his last meal. Michael Kent Poland. Michael Kent Poland, 36, and his brother Patrick disguised themselves as highway patrol officers on May 24, 1977, to stop a Purolator armored truck on Interstate 17 near Phoenix, Arizona. After kidnapping guards Russell Dempsey and Cecil Newkirk, they stole nearly $300,000 and took the men to Lake Mead, where they placed them alive into canvas bags weighted with rocks and dumped them into the water. The bodies were recovered 3 weeks later, and evidence, including the bags, weapons, badges, and money trail, led to the brothers' arrest. Sentenced to death in 1980, their sentences were overturned in 1982 due to jury misconduct, but they were retried in 1983, again convicted and sentenced to death. In his final years, Michael's defense argued he was mentally incompetent for execution, citing delusions, but courts disagreed. On June 16, 1999, at age 58, he was executed by lethal injection in Florence, Arizona, after more than 16 years on death row. His children witnessed the execution, to whom he silently said, "I love you." His last meal the day before included fried eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, cereal, milk, and coffee. When asked for last words, Michael replied sarcastically, "I'd like to know if they're going to bring me lunch afterward. I'm really hungry. I can't think of anything else." Ignacio Alberto Ortiz. On December 21, 1978, Ignacio Alberto Ortiz, 37, murdered 30-year-old Manuelita McCormack in her home in Pima County, Arizona, after attempting to rekindle an unreciprocated romantic relationship. After strangling and stabbing Manuelita in front of her 8-year-old daughter, Bernice, he also attacked Patricia, 9, and Bernice, stabbing them in the chest. Before leaving, he poured gasoline inside the house, left an incendiary device, and set the place on fire. The girls managed to escape along with their younger brother, Charlie. Arrested the next day, Ortiz was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, arson, burglary, and conspiracy to commit murder, after trying to hire another inmate to kill the surviving children and other family members. In 1979, he was sentenced to death and life imprisonment for the conspiracy, plus additional prison terms. On October 27, 1999, at age 57, Ortiz was executed by lethal injection at the Arizona State Prison after spending 21 years on death row and without intervention from the governor. His last meal included fried eggs with hot sauce, bacon, sirloin steak, French fries with ketchup, vanilla ice cream, milk, and coffee. His final words were, "Yes, I do. Jesus Christ is Lord," which he then repeated in Spanish, "Jesucristo es el Señor," concluding with, "Heavenly Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." He neither looked at nor apologized to the victims' relatives present, of whom only one daughter witnessed the execution. Anthony Lee Cheney. In September 1982, Anthony Lee Cheney and his girlfriend Deanna Jo Saunders Coleman were on the run after committing a series of robberies in Texas and Colorado. They arrived in Arizona driving a stolen truck and carrying stolen weapons. While camping near Flagstaff to avoid police checkpoints, Officer Robert Klein discovered them, but Cheney held him at gunpoint and handcuffed him to a tree. Shortly after, Cheney intercepted Reserve Officer John Jameson, shooting him more than 30 times before delivering a final close-range shot to end his life. Later, Cheney stole another vehicle but spared the victims, who then alerted the police, leading to his arrest. Cheney was sentenced to death on March 17, 1983, spending 17 years on death row. During his appeals, his defense argued mental health issues, but all appeals were denied. The day before his execution, Cheney was offered a last meal. He requested fried eggs, bacon, coffee, vanilla ice cream, canned peaches, and strawberry jam. On February 16, 2000, Cheney was executed in Arizona. When asked for his last words, he simply replied, "No." He was pronounced dead at 9:10 p.m. Patrick Gene Poland. On May 24, 1977, Security guards Russell Dempsey and Cecil Newkirk were on duty for Purelator Courier. As they drove along Interstate 17, they were pulled over by what they believed to be a police vehicle. After stopping, the men, who thought they were dealing with law enforcement, were ordered to open their armored truck. At that moment, brothers Michael and Patrick Poland took control of the vehicle. The guards were placed inside canvas bags and thrown into Lake Mead. The Poland brothers later claimed that one of the guards had a heart attack, forcing them to kill the other. During the robbery, they managed to steal $228,000. Both brothers were sentenced to death for the crime. Patrick Gene Poland was executed by lethal injection in Arizona on March 15, 2000. He was one of the two brothers executed for their role in the crime, following his brother Michael's execution in 1999. Unlike his brother, Patrick did not request a last meal, choosing instead to use his remaining time to express remorse for the suffering he and his brother had caused. His final words were, "If I may, once again, to the Newkirk and Dempsey families, I apologize. I am sincere. I regret the pain and suffering I have caused. Thank you for your forgiveness. I ask my family to forgive me for the pain I have caused them. I ask all my friends and those who believed in me to forgive me, and I ask the woman I love to remember that I will always love her." The lethal injection procedure began at 3:03 p.m. As the chemicals entered his body, Poland's head shook 4 times. Robert Henry Mormon. On January 13, 1984, during a 72-hour prison furlough, 35-year-old Robert Henry Mormon murdered and dismembered his 74-year-old adoptive mother, Roberta Mormon, at the Blue Mist Motel in Florence, Arizona, just minutes from the state prison where he was serving a life sentence for kidnapping and sexually assaulting an 8-year-old girl in 1972. Mormon, adopted at age 7 after a childhood of abandonment and abuse, had a long history of psychological issues. He claimed the killing followed years of sexual abuse and financial manipulation by Roberta. After suffocating her with a pillow, he stabbed her multiple times, then meticulously cut up her body, placing the remains in trash bins and sewers. When questioned, he told locals the bags contained animal waste, but his suspicious behavior led to police intervention. Officers found blood in the room, a knife, saws, and $500 hidden in the victim's bra. In 1985, a Pinal County jury found Mormon guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was based on 3 aggravating factors: his prior life sentence, financial motives related to inheritance, and the cruel and depraved nature of the crime. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld the death sentence in 1987, rejecting an insanity defense. Over the years, Mormon's attorneys raised concerns about his mental capacity. He had been diagnosed with intellectual disability from childhood, attended special education classes, and had been institutionalized at age 13. In 2005, it was revealed that critical biological evidence had been destroyed in 1987, eliminating any chance for DNA testing. In 2011, the Ninth Circuit Court denied his habeas petition, ruling that Mormon understood the consequences of his actions. Arizona's Board of Executive Clemency denied clemency by a 3-2 vote. Governor Jan Brewer supported the decision. Mormon spent his final hours with a Catholic deacon, receiving communion and saying, "I trust in God." In his last meal before being executed, Mormon requested a double hamburger, beef burritos, Rocky Road ice cream, and 3 RC Colas. On February 29, 2012, Robert Henry Mormon was executed by lethal injection at Florence State Prison. He was 63 years old. Arizona used a single drug protocol for the first time, administering pentobarbital. The state failed to notify Mormon's attorneys 7 days in advance as required by their own policy. His final words were, I hope this brings closure and you can begin to heal. I hope you can forgive me over time. Robert Charles Towery. On September 4, 1991, 29-year-old Robert Charles Towery murdered 68-year-old Mark Jones during a robbery at the victim's home in Scottsdale, Arizona. Jones, a generous man known for helping students and struggling acquaintances, had previously hired Towery as a mechanic. That trust would cost him his life. Towery and his accomplice, Randy Allen Barker, planned the robbery for weeks. They took a taxi to Jones's home, pretending to need help with a broken car. Once inside, Towery pulled a gun while Barker handcuffed Jones. They stole valuables, electronics, and cash, loading everything into Jones's Lincoln Continental. Then, Towery offered Jones a choice: to be tied up or sedated. When Jones chose the latter, Towery injected him with battery acid, a corrosive substance that failed to kill him. Towery then strangled Jones with plastic zip ties, tightening them twice to ensure he was dead. The body was found the next day. A security guard had reported seeing the two men abandon the stolen car, leading to their arrest. In 1992, a jury in Maricopa County found Towery guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and other charges. His death sentence was based on the brutality of the crime and his prior criminal record. Barker, who testified against him, was sentenced to second-degree murder and released in 2001. On March 8, 2012, at the Florence State Prison, Robert Charles Towery was executed by lethal injection. He was 47 years old. In his final statement, he said, "I apologize to Mark's family and to my loved ones. So many times in life I turned left when I should have turned right, mistake after mistake." His last words were, "I love my family. Papa, Papa, Papa." A message for his nephew, meant to echo the sound of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Thomas Arnold Kemp Jr. On July 11, 1992, 43-year-old Thomas Arnold Kemp Jr. kidnapped 25-year-old college student Hector Soto Juarez from a Tucson apartment parking lot. With an accomplice, Jeffrey Logan, Kemp forced Juarez to withdraw $200 from an ATM before driving him to the remote Silver Bell mine. There, Kemp ordered Juarez to undress and shot him twice in the head. The murder was later revealed to be racially motivated. In March 1993, Kemp was convicted of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. At sentencing, he showed no remorse, stating, "I don't show mercy, and I'm certainly not here to beg for it." The court cited multiple aggravating factors, including extreme cruelty and future danger to society, and sentenced him to death. During his time on death row, Kemp made headlines for his racist views. At trial, he said, "If more of them ended up dead, the rest would learn to stay in Mexico where they belong." He refused to attend his clemency hearings, calling them a circus show. In his final hours, Kemp declined spiritual counsel. For his last meal, he requested a bacon cheeseburger, French fries, root beer, boysenberry pie, and strawberry ice cream. Thomas Arnold Kemp Jr. was executed by lethal injection on April 25, 2012, at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. He was pronounced dead at 10:08 a.m. at the age of 63. His final words were delivered firmly, "I regret nothing." Samuel Villegas Lopez. On October 29, 1986, 24-year-old Samuel Villegas Lopez broke into the Phoenix apartment of 59-year-old seamstress Estefana Holmes. Inside, he brutally attacked her, raping her, binding her with her own clothing, and stabbing her 23 times in the chest and abdomen. He slashed her throat with one of her kitchen knives. The scene showed signs of a prolonged struggle, with blood found in nearly every room. Lopez was arrested days later while being questioned for an unrelated assault. In 1987, he was tried and sentenced to death. His court-appointed lawyer, with no experience in capital cases, called no witnesses and failed to present any mitigating evidence. The judge imposed the death sentence, citing the extreme cruelty of the crime. Lopez spent 25 years on death row, filing numerous appeals. His attorneys argued ineffective counsel and the unfair application of sentencing reforms. All appeals were denied. On June 26, 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Arizona Governor Jan Brewer and the State Clemency Board also denied his request for commutation. In his last meal before execution, Lopez requested red and green chili beef, rice, avocado, French fries, vanilla ice cream, and pineapple. When asked if he wanted to say any final words, he replied, "No, I don't want to." Samuel Villegas Lopez was executed by lethal injection on June 27, 2012, at Florence State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 10:37 a.m., 29 minutes after the procedure began. He was 49 years old. Daniel Wayne Cook. In July 1987, Daniel Wayne Cook and his roommate John Matsky planned to rob a co-worker, Carlos Cruz Ramos, in Lake Havasu City. After taking some money, a confrontation led to a violent attack. Cook inflicted serious physical harm on Cruz Ramos over several hours, which resulted in his death. Later, 16-year-old Kevin Swanee arrived at the scene, and Cook and Matsky also attacked and killed him. Matsky surrendered to police and confessed, receiving a reduced sentence. Cook was arrested shortly after and admitted that the situation got out of control. In 1988, Cook chose to represent himself at trial. The court denied his request for a mental health expert during sentencing, and no mitigating evidence was presented. He was convicted and sentenced to death based on the severity of the crimes. Later, evidence showed Cook had a history of severe childhood abuse and mental health issues. The lead prosecutor later said that, had this been known, the death penalty might not have been pursued. Cook's appeals were denied by the courts, and the governor did not intervene. On August 8, 2012, Cook was executed by lethal injection at Florence State Prison. The process lasted about 40 minutes without visible problems. For his last meal, Cook requested eggplant lasagna, garlic mashed potatoes with cheese, roasted Brussels sprouts, braised asparagus, ice cream, and root beer. Arizona eliminated special last meals after Cook's extravagant request, switching to standard meal options. His execution was among the last before the state temporarily suspended the death penalty due to drug protocol controversies. His last words were, "I want to apologize to the victims' families. I know it's not enough. Where am I? To my lawyers, thank you. Red Robin, yum, I'm done. I love you all." Richard Dale Stokely. On July 8, 1991, 38-year-old Richard Dale Stockley and 19-year-old Randy Braziel abducted 13-year-olds Mandy Myers and Mary Snyder during a 4th of July festival in Elfrida, Cochise County, Arizona. The girls were taken to a remote area where they were assaulted, strangled, and fatally injured. Stockley further desecrated their bodies before disposing of them in a flooded mine shaft. Days later, Braziel confessed to the police in Chandler, leading to the recovery of the bodies. Stockley also admitted involvement, though he later tried to take back his statement. DNA evidence later linked Braziel to the crimes, but he had already secured a plea agreement. In 1992, a Cochise County jury found Stockley guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and inappropriate conduct with a minor. The prosecution highlighted the cruelty and premeditation of the crimes. He was sentenced to death. For his final meal, Stockley requested a porterhouse steak, French fries, fried okra, a salad with blue cheese dressing, cheddar cheese, rolls, fresh fruit, and chocolate ice cream. On December 5, 2012, Richard Dale Stokely was executed by lethal injection at Florence State Prison. Medical staff faced difficulties establishing an IV line, eventually making a surgical incision in a major vein. Just before the drugs were administered, he said, "I wish I could die doing something meaningful. This just seems like a waste." He offered no apology to the families. Patricia Hancock, mother of one victim, called him a coward for not taking responsibility. He was pronounced dead at age 60. Aaron Gunches. On November 14, 2002, Aaron Brian Gunches went to his girlfriend's house in Mesa, Arizona. Upon arrival, he forced Ted Price to get into his car, with the supposed intention of taking him to a bus station. However, realizing he didn't have money for a ticket, he drove him to a desert area along the Beeline Highway. There, he shot Price 4 times, ending his life. On January 15, 2003, an Arizona public safety officer stopped Gunches at a traffic checkpoint. Gunches fired twice at the officer before fleeing, leading to a chase involving more than 50 officers. He was arrested the following day, found hiding in a barn in Wendon. In 2004, he pled guilty to the crime, and in 2008, he was sentenced to death. Since then, he has repeatedly requested his own execution and criticized the state for not carrying it out. Although his execution, scheduled for April 6, 2023, was postponed. After new legal proceedings, the Arizona Supreme Court set his execution for March 19, 2025, by lethal injection. One day before his execution, he was offered a last meal, which consisted of a double Western-style burger, spicy gyros, onion rings, and baklava. Gunch's execution took place on March 19, 2025, at the Florence State Prison. He was executed by lethal injection and declared dead at 10:33 a.m.